This video is going to talk about knitting in ends in two different situations in knitting in the round. So when we're knitting back and forth, it's really easy to do because you knit in one end going one direction, and then when you come back, you purl it in the other direction, and that crisscross really helps you make sure you don't have any gaps. But we don't have that situation when we're working in the round, so let's talk about how to make sure that we don't inadvertently cause things to open up and get all gappy. There are two basic situations when knitting in the round. One is when we're adding in a new color and we're just completely switching colors. So we can clip the old one, we're moving on, we're not going to use green again for a while, and so we're just making a hard transition. The second situation that we will talk about is when you're adding a new color but not getting rid of the old one. So maybe you're adding a second ball so that you can do color work, or maybe you're adding it so that you can do some kind of like an alternating the skein at the end of the skein so that you don't get a big harsh line when you stop one ball of yarn and move to the second. Say with some hand-dyed yarns, you might want to alternate them so that there's that transition, and that is a different situation. So let's talk about that. When we are stopping one yarn and switching to a new one, that's a fairly straightforward situation. What you're going to be doing is really simple. You're going to pick up the new yarn and you will knit one stitch with it, or purl, depending on your pattern, work one stitch, let's say. I always have to make sure that I haven't accidentally shortened mine too much as I was going, like I have done here. So I'm going to just tug on this and make sure that it's longer again. And now that I have this yarn sort of securely or somewhat secure and something to work with, we can actually start working in this end. So all we do is we take this end and we go up and over the working yarn, and then we work the next stitch. Up and over the working yarn, work the next stitch. Now, I prefer to actually put my needle through the stitch, and depending on whether the needles are grippy or what, I will either just let it hang or I will pinch it while I do the yarn. So then I go up and over. So, new yarn, old tail is the first step. And I would do, generally speaking, I like to do a minimum of 10 stitches. If the yarn is, or if the stitches are smaller, I will do more stitches. So for instance, if I was doing a sock, I would probably do more like 15 or even 20 stitches. And it's almost more like the distance traveled is what I'm working on. So like I said, I would just keep throwing that working yarn around, throwing the end around the working yarn, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, look at that. That worked out perfectly. So that's that. I would just drop this yarn now, tuck it away so it's not going to get in my way, and work around to the transition again. What I'm going to do is, rather than working all the way to the first stitch of the round in the new color, I'm actually going to start wrapping that end around the working yarn now. And that will help us bridge the distance between here and here, which will close the gap. So you can see I'm going to be pulling the yarn across, and so that pulling across is going to kind of help bridge the situation, hopefully keep us from getting a gap. So I'm going to wrap the tail of the new yarn around the working yarn now. I'm going to work that stitch. And then I'm going to keep working in the round for about 10 stitches, throwing the tail around the working yarn each time. Now there is a way to hold both the tail and the working yarn in your left hand and to do a little swoopy thing with your needle as you are going. I do not understand quite how that works. It hurts my brain a little bit. When I've tried it, I've gotten really clumsy, and since this is not that annoying, I have just been fine and happy going along in this circumstance doing this version. And you will not be learning the other version from me, at least not today, until I can get my brain around what is going on in that situation. What does it look like afterwards? If you look here, from here over is where I have both of the ends woven in or knitted in after I changed stitches. I didn't do anything to mitigate the jog. So when we knit in the round, we get jogs when we do joins, but I didn't do anything to mitigate that. I wanted you to only be seeing whether or not you can see the ends through and what that looks like in terms of tension and the like. And as you can see, it looks really good. When we flip this inside out to show you, what you will see is a nice situation where the yarn spirals around. So here the silver yarn is spiraling around, and then here the green yarn is spiraling around. And while it looks a little big, it is just fine. I've even done this on the bottom of socks and not noticed it when I was walking. So it is a comfortable, nice situation. So if you find that the very last stitch of a color just has a bit more fabric to it than you want, if you just grab the tip of a needle and just tug it across, you can redistribute the tension from that first stitch, I guess the last stitch I should call it, across the row, and each stitch will just be marginally bigger than it was before you did this, but all of the stitches will look much more similar to each other rather than having all of them similar except for this last one. So if after you've blocked it, you want to redistribute that, you can just kind of tug it across. But generally speaking, it works its way in and looks really good and really invisible, and you've taken care of your ends as you've gone. You can, of course, do this when you first start your work as well. Come around to the beginning and just knit your end right in. Let's say it's time to join a new color or a new ball of yarn, but we're not going to cut our old yarn. We would simply start by grabbing the new yarn, making sure we have a nice long tail. Leave it off the back, and we're just going to knit around. We're going to let the old yarn hang down, and the new yarn's tail is just going to hang around. And we're going to resist the temptation to start weaving it in right now. If we weave it in right now, we will get a gap. So we just knit around. Okay, back at the end. Now before we start the new colored stitch, in that last color from the old color, or the old ball if we're keeping the color same, now we take our tail and we wrap it around the working yarn. We make sure to kind of hold it nice and snug, and then we work onwards. If we needed to change yarns, it would be the same, whether I picked up the gray and worked this stitch or kept working with the blue and kept going. We would just work our way around, weaving in the tail as we go by knitting around it, throwing it up and over the working yarn for about 10 stitches or more. You'll notice that this stitch is a little sloppy, but that's just because we've dropped the yarn. And when we go to pick it up to knit it, when we switch back to using this yarn, we will just make sure that this yarn is the same size stitch as the stitches below it and around it. So always whenever you're switching yarn, make sure you grab the yarn, check out how that last stitch is looking, make sure it looks like the other ones, and then don't pull so tight that the fabric wants to snug up behind. You never want that when you're carrying the yarn up. We never want that to be so tight that it's a problem. We also don't want it to be so loose that this stitch gets really sloppy again. So it's kind of a balancing act, but you'll kind of be able to sense it based on the way this first stitch and last stitch are looking as you work those. So you would knit around, and then what do we do? I haven't shown you that yet. When we switch colors, well, I like to wait until after I've blocked to trim my ends for this sort of thing. We could tighten this up. You can see how it looks kind of like really spiral sloppy. So we could tighten this up. But knitting is stretchy. So when you flex it, when people wear it, when it gets a little worn, you pull it on over your head or whatever, those stitches are going to stretch out again. So until I've blocked it and sort of set things the way they want to be, I like to just wait, and then let's assume I have blocked this. It's now time to trim the ends. I just trim the ends. And that's it. I've knit in my ends, I've blocked it, and now I trim them. And I move on with life. I hope this tutorial helps you and you really enjoy this method, because it doesn't leave you with all this stuff to deal with at the end of a project. I want to finish a project and be excited rather than full of dread. Happy knitting!